Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and again, thank you both for being here. Sound like a broken record on these. Sadly, this has been going on for 8 years with a lot of deaths, including 50,000 children in Syria, which is just absolutely abhorrent. I do want to start with some good news, though, which is I think this administration deserves a lot of credit for a very improved Syria policy. We spoke a good game in the last administration, but I feel like all too often there was inaction, most notably the red line in Syria, when I think was the perfect opportunity to basically get rid of the Syrian regime and do it in a way that would have ended far better than what we see today in Syria. But that said, I think the administration has made it clear that there is American and humanitarian interest in Syria that we'll defend. We don't want to see Iran with a post whatever goes on presence in Syria. We've been clear about the need to stop the land bridge to Israel and all those other things. I do want to echo the chairwoman's concern about aid, though, as well. I think we need to really take a good, solid look at how we're distributing aid. I think the UN does us a disservice in some of that in terms of legitimizing the regime. I think there's areas maybe we can do aid directly, especially areas and communities near U.S. military troops as they starve and they look 100 feet away and see well-fed American troops, and the opposition uses that, the evil folks use that as a propaganda win. So I thank you again both for being here, your great service, and Madam Chair, I thank you for your fantastic service. It's been a pleasure serving with you, and I mentioned earlier in my opening statement, this administration and frankly the prior administration inherited a really bad situation in Syria, of which there's no easy answers. I do think that one of the solutions we need to do is to frankly target Assad. I think target his military. I think that can compel Assad and Russia to the table to a solution. I understand that may not be on the table. I'm not sure the internal discussions, but I think that would actually be the fastest way to compel the Russians and the Iranians and the Syrians to the table. Let me just ask you really quickly, Mr. Ambassador, has the administration taken a position on the Caesar Act, the Caesar Civilian Protection Act?
I do not believe we have taken a specific position on that particular piece of legislation. You know, it's complicated for us to do that on a particular piece of legislation. More generally, we believe that the more sanctions we can impose on that regime, particularly in key strategic areas that serve their military, that serve the regime directly, all the better for our entire policy. And if this House can help in one way or the other without endorsing specific legislation, that's our position.
Well, I'd like to ping-pong that back to you. We've passed the Syrian Civilian Protection Act here. It is in the Senate. As I know, it's been hotlined, but there is at least one senator with a more exotic view on foreign policy than most people have that's trying to slow that up, and I think the administration is probably the last hope to get that through. So you don't have to comment on that, but I think it's something worth noting because we have a very limited time, and that would be our best shot. Given that there's been a lot of attention with Saudi Arabia and their actions with the journalist, which I think the actions were abhorrent, but just this week we learned the fate of Layla, a Chicago-born aid worker helping displaced persons in eastern Ghouta. Layla disappeared over 2 years ago, where she was detained and tortured for 8 months before being transferred to a military court. This week, our worst fears were confirmed. She was tortured and executed by Assad's forces on December 28th, just after Christmas 2016. We know that Bashar al-Assad and his Russian and Iranian backers have committed countless war crimes like those endured by Layla, and yet we haven't acted on that, and that's where I want to begin. With the news of Layla's death, she became the first American citizen that we know of to be killed by the Assad regime. And this is an incredibly important point to note. Whatever response the administration decides to take will shape how the regime and its backers treat other Americans in their custody now or potentially in their custody in the future. Mr. Ambassador, how does the administration plan to respond to the killing of an American in Syrian soil?
We can confirm that she is deceased and that this was in Syrian government hands. We're looking into that. This is something that, just like you, we take very, very seriously. If I can change my testimony from a moment ago, we do support the Caesar Act.
Great, thank you. Thank you for clarifying the administration's support of that. That's, I think, very important. Thank you. Do you know status of any other Americans currently being held in Assad's torture and detention facilities?
There is various inquiries underway. There are reports. None of these I can talk about in an open session.
Understood. We all know that there's 4 broad instruments of power the United States can use: diplomatic, information, military, and economic. I think we've used a number of those well. One is that I think is important to note is information. Earlier this year, the administration decided to withdraw all assistance from northwest Syria, and some of those funds have been reinstated, which we appreciate, but others have been ignored. As was mentioned earlier, Radio Fresh, which I actually did an interview on a number of years ago, was run by a man that I had a pleasure to meet, Mr. Ferris. The programming was centered around anti-extremism messaging and reached 2 million of the most at-risk individuals for radicalization. Unlike northeast Syria, where we have a military presence, U.S. stabilization aid is our only leverage to push back against radicalism in the Northwest. And last Friday, he was assassinated by the same terrorist groups he dedicated his life to speaking out against. He was a U.S. partner and one of our most effective bulwarks against the rise of al-Qaeda in Syria. How do you think, Mr. Ambassador, the United States can learn from his assassination so that critical programs in Idlib can get renewed U.S. funding?
Mr. Congressman, this is one of my top priorities, is to review not just that particular program, Radio Fresh, but also the aid to the white helmets, which we're able to restore temporarily, and several other programs. You know the backstory, I'm sure. When we suddenly lost all American assistance to the Northeast, where we have troops in contact, we shifted whatever money we could into that area. We're now looking at the consequences of that, particularly with the situation around Idlib, which is of strategic concern to us just as much as the Northeast. And we'll have to get back to you on it, but it is something we take very, very seriously.
And I believe you do, and thank you. And nobody wants to waste money, but we want to spend it effectively. My time's up, and Mr. Jenkins, while I don't have a question for you, and I apologize for that, I want to say thank you for your hard work, too, and everybody that works for you. I think many times the work that you and your folks do gets overlooked, but it's extremely important. So thank you, and please pass that on. For both of you, thank you for being here.
Amen.